Welcome back to the Sunday Long Read podcast. My name's Amanda Ulrich. I'm a journalist and college lecturer based in California, and this week we're diving into a new episode of our Behind the Story series. Today's story is about teenagers and opioids, more specifically fentanyl. Lizzie Presser, a reporter for ProPublica, wrote this piece about two different teenagers who were caught on opposite sides of the drug trade, one who was dealing and one who was using. Well, hi, Lizzie. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Amanda. I'm happy to be here.
So I guess just to start off my first question, in this story, you, of course, write about Malia, who's a 15-year-old who was selling fake Percocet pills but wasn't stopped in time by police. And then another teenager named Jack on the other side of this who overdosed on one of those fake pills that Malia was selling, which ended up being fentanyl. How did you find these two teenagers in the first place?
I became interested in the story when there was a paper that was published. It was a secret shopper study, and it found that there were only 39 rehabs in the country that would provide buprenorphine, which is the gold standard treatment for opioid addiction, to minors. And that number just startled me. And the more that I dug into the world of teenagers and opioids, and in particular these days that's fentanyl, the more I felt like, how are these kids surviving? On the one hand, they can't get treatment. And we know that access to buprenorphine for adults is bad. It's so much worse for minors. And then at the same time, we're seeing this surge in drug-induced homicide charges and prosecutions. And as I kind of dug around the internet, I started to notice that kids, too, were getting hit with these charges. And so I really wanted to tell a story that got at this impossible position that kids find themselves in, where really they're at risk of overdosing, such a high risk of overdosing, because they don't quite understand what's in the drug supply, because they aren't getting access to the best medical treatment available to them. And at the same time, they're also at risk of being charged with homicide and put in prison for a very long time. And I really wanted to get at that space, like how difficult it is to survive until 18 years old as a teenager who is struggling with an opioid addiction. I ended up writing to a bunch of lawyers for teens who had been charged with drug-induced homicide to see if their clients wanted to talk with me. And Malia was the first who said that she really did. And when I met her, I knew that I wanted to tell her story.
Definitely. Okay, so you kind of cast a wider net to find who might work for this, and Malia's case ended up being the one that you focused on.
And part of the reason, there were two reasons why Malia was interesting to me. One was that I could see in the criminal complaint that Jack had been to rehab. And so I knew there was going to be a story there about his search for help with his addiction. And then Malia, I thought, was particularly interesting to write about because she wasn't this kind of quote unquote perfect victim of the judicial system, right? Like she wasn't a friend who gave a pill to her neighbor or her classmate. She was a young girl, a 15-year-old who was dealing. She was selling fentanyl. And I wanted that story because that is part of what is happening across America. I mean, in my reporting, I was meeting kids who were dealing fentanyl under the age of 18 all across the country. And I didn't want to just tell a story of a kind of a mistaken charge. Like this young girl had gone forward with this as a business plan.
Right. So you knew that you would have that piece from Malia. Did you know if you would be able to get, to be able to talk to any members of Jack's family in the beginning, or you just pushed forward hoping that you'd be able to tell both of those sides?
I had a strong feeling that if I couldn't get Jack's family, I would probably kill the story. So I reached out to Jack's mom pretty early. I actually reached out to a friend of Jack's first, and she put me in touch with Jack's mom as well. And really from the get-go, Carrie, Jack's mother, did want to talk and did think it was super important to tell Jack's story. And she wanted to work with me on this. And so once I had both sides talking to me, I knew that I would be able to work on this piece.
Definitely. And in a second, I did think that Jack's mom had some of the most powerful quotes of this story that I definitely want to get into. I mean, there's so much reporting in this story. I was reading at the bottom of this ProPublica story that you made several public records requests and then reported from several different states and then interviewed pediatricians and police officers and everyone in between. How much time did you kind of allocate to this project, or what was your initial plan once you started getting those different pieces of reporting to put it together?
I think for me, I was wondering if I was going to write two stories. Was I going to write one story about the criminal justice system and one story about kids who were trying to find treatment and having a really difficult time getting it? And so I spent a long time casting for two separate stories. And that meant that I was going to talk with the pediatricians who were working with kids and the addiction specialists who were working with kids who had an opioid use disorder. There are not very many of them in this country. And I was traveling out to Denver. I traveled to California. I traveled to Baltimore, down to DC, to kind of get a sense of what this treatment looked like and to talk to young people who desperately wanted to not be using fentanyl and were having so much trouble getting there because of how difficult it was to access the medical treatment that they needed. That in some ways encouraged this reporting because I could see and hear from so many young people and doctors just how crucial this kind of treatment was, and just how crucial it was to be creating some structure that these kids could find, because they were trying in all these different ways, showing up to hospitals, overdosing, being in the ER, calling all the doctors in the area, calling all of the rehabs in the area. Some of them were going to rehab several times and not getting buprenorphine, which was what they needed to help them get off of the fentanyl that they were addicted to. So I think it was that reporting that allowed me to see a bigger picture in the Malia and Jack story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I also, pretty early on in this story, you mentioned that 22 high school age kids are dying from overdoses every week. In other words, that's a classroom's worth of students is how you kind of frame it. Do you think part of the problem is that people aren't realizing how big that problem is, that they're not realizing that teens are being swept up in this on the scale that they are?
Yes and no. I mean, I think that schools really know. If you work at a school where kids are using fentanyl and you're a teacher there, you're not oblivious to it. I think that when it comes to pediatricians' offices, they don't know, because it's not like this is all going to be, the volume isn't that high of the number of kids who are using fentanyl, right? I mentioned that according to the best data available, there are over 300,000 young people under the age of 18 who have an opioid use disorder. That's the estimate right now. That's a lot of kids, but they're not all concentrated. Mm-hmm. And so it's difficult to find them and to touch their lives. And when they can't get into the centers that generally treat addiction for adults, it's unclear where they're going. And that's something I also wanted to get across in this piece. How are we catching these kids? How are we giving them a place to find the help that they need?
Right. And that seems evidenced by Jack's mother, who, she says at one point that before Jack died, she wasn't thinking that he was using fentanyl, that she was just thinking that this was Percocet that he was using. So it seems like for some people, they may not even be adding that into the equation.
I think what was so alarming to me as well is that it's not only that she didn't realize that there was fentanyl in the drugs that he was using. It was that she was talking to teachers. She was talking to police officers. She was talking to doctors. She was talking to rehab centers about her son. And none of them, according to her, warned her that the so-called Percocets that her son was using were likely actually fentanyl. And that is what I could not get my head around. Imagine being a mother and having no idea, first of all, what to look for if your child is using Percocet, And then add onto that another layer, which is how do you know if they're fake or they're real? And if they are fake, are they actually fentanyl? Like, we haven't come to terms with the fact, I think, as a country, that kids are using fentanyl, and then we're not giving parents the information they need to look for the signs and to get their kids the treatment they need at the same time.
Yeah, I think another part of your story that was powerful related to this is that you're trying to make kind of this abstract idea like a little bit more concrete for people. And you say that with the amount of fentanyl that could kill someone, if you poured that on a penny, that it would only cover Abraham Lincoln's ear. Were comparisons like that kind of important for you to weave in there for those people who aren't experts on this and not, their lives, they're not, thinking about some of these more granular details of overdoses and fentanyl? Was that important for you to kind of like bring this home through those comparisons?
I think part of the kind of hypocrisy of the law and of the way that we are thinking about kids and fentanyl is that at the same time as all of these news articles that we're seeing across the country, another child dies of fentanyl overdose, didn't know that there was fentanyl in whatever drug they took, we're seeing kids like Maylia being charged with homicide as if they knew that the drug that they were giving to someone else could kill them, right? But the truth of the matter is these kids don't understand. And that's something that we have come to terms with in our legal system, that kids just are not as able as adults to compute the consequences of their actions. And neither Maylia nor Jack was understanding that just the tiniest bit too much of that fentanyl that was in these pills could kill.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that was what was striking in some of those comments from Maylia is, it seems like she didn't totally, of course, as a 15-year-old, didn't totally grasp exactly how lethal some of those laced pills could be.
And I think most people don't, right? And I think most kids certainly don't. And so even if they're asking for pills that they know have some fentanyl in them, no one thinks that they're going to die, especially not a child who is much more likely to be impulsive and to not think about the consequences of their actions.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think another big part of your story that was, the emotional backbone of it was the texts and the letters and the journal entries that you were including from both Maylia and Jack. What was your process of getting those? Was that just, as you were doing interviews with family members and with Maylia, and what was your process of piecing together those like very personal documents?
With Maylia, pretty early on, I guess maybe a few months into talking with her, she offered to show me her journals, which is always kind of a trove for a journalist because I get to see how her thinking had evolved over a period of time when I didn't know her and how it was continuing to evolve when I did. That was I'm always looking for contemporaneous reporting, whether it's through like medical records or through journals or through text messages. And so I was super lucky that Maylia was keeping a journal and felt like she could trust me enough to share them with me. With Jack, I had a more difficult task because Jack wasn't around to talk to me about his life. And so it was really important to me to try to find his voice somewhere. And he wasn't someone who kept a journal. And when he died, his phone was locked. And so no one was able to get into it, not even the police. I was lucky because his mother, when she had confiscated his phone at one point, had started taking a lot of photographs of his text messages and screenshots. And so over the course of reporting, she would find new batches of texts that she had found and send them over to me. And so little by little, I was pulling out bits of his voice and trying to figure out how best to weave it into the story. It's interesting. There's one little text that I found a couple nights before we closed the story that his mother sent me really late, which was when a friend of his had written to him and said, I've already lost 2 classmates. I really don't want to lose you too, man. And Jack's like, oh, you can't die from a single Percocet. Don't worry about me. And that broke my heart because he really did believe that he was okay, that just 1 Percocet a day would be fine. And I was really glad I was able to include that in the piece.
As you're reading your story, I think that really hits home that there's no one who's telling teens that the gravity of this situation.
I think that's exactly right. And I think there's this kind of messaging that's going out from police offices and schools to parents, like, talk to your kids about drugs. But what we all know is that kids experiment with drugs from a young age. They have since the beginning of time. And they're not necessarily listening to their parents, and they're not necessarily turning to their parents for advice. So the question is, where can we reach these kids, and why aren't we trying to reach them in new ways?
And also, do you think that experimentation, when it involves something as lethal as fentanyl, that, that kind of child experimentation takes on a new level? I mean, that's kind of what I was feeling as I was reading your story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it takes on a new urgency without a question. I mean, I cannot imagine growing up around fentanyl. There was no risk of that kind of overdose when I was growing up. I don't think that young people who are using Percocets and who are smoking them quite understand just how different it is from even a couple of generations ago.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Is there another, you talk about that one text that you got kind of before you wrap the story. Is there another piece of writing from either Melia or Jack that, as you've finished this story and done the reporting and kind of like wrapped it up, that sticks with you, that ends up being something that pops in your mind more frequently?
I think there are two that come to mind. One is that it was very hard to get a sense of where Jack was in his head with his addiction. And I think one thing that a lot of people don't understand, and quite frankly, that it took me a long time to get my head around, is the ambivalence of addiction, right? How you can want to get better and want to keep using at the same time. And this is kind of a hallmark of some addictions. And so there are moments in the piece where you can see that Jack is saying to his girlfriend's mother, your daughter is in trouble and we took the wrong road and you need to get help from her. Like, he is well aware of how deep into this addiction he is. And then other moments in which he's saying to a doctor, I'm fine. I don't have any kind of dependency. I'm good. I don't know why I'm at this rehab at all. And I thought it was really important to draw out that nuance in this piece, right? Addiction is super complicated to treat for this reason as well, not just because there isn't access to the medication, but because you are working with patients who are holding these two things at once, this desire to get better and this desire to keep using. So I think for Jack, that's the other one that sticks with me. With Melia, what I found really hard to read in her journals were paragraphs in which she was blaming herself. And I think on the one hand, I was kind of in awe of her ability to take accountability for her actions and to write into that. And on the other, I found it deeply disturbing that she had grown up in these horrible conditions with a mother who had her own struggle with addiction, who wasn't keeping her safe and fed, without the opportunity to get 3 meals a day for most of her life. She was hungry for most of her life. And the fact that she got to a place in her journey in jail where she was blaming herself for what had happened, I think that deeply disturbed me, that we don't have a safety net available for kids like Melia to help her off of this path that she was on at a younger age.
Hello, I'm Albert Samaha. I'm an award-winning journalist at The Washington Post, author most recently of the book Concepcion, and the guest editor of the Sunday Long Reads True Crime Spotlight newsletter. Check out our monthly newsletter, where I'm curating the best true crime stories, from thrilling narratives through little-known underworlds to investigations that expose corporate or police misconduct. You can subscribe at sundaylongread.com/truecrime. That's sundaylongread.com/truecrime. Hope you'll join us. Peace.
Do you think that there's any change that could have happened in Melia's life? Do you think there's any specific person that if they had acted would have changed the course of this? Or do you think that it's easier in hindsight to look back and that it's also maybe a response in a situation like this to try and point fingers, when in reality it's hard to kind of nail down what could have changed this outcome?
I mean, I think the counterfactual is just impossible to know. But I think what I was trying to get at with that summation was that we have established in this country that children, not adults, but children, are entitled to shelter and are entitled to food. And Malia wasn't getting shelter or food or any other kind of protection from her mother that children in this country have the right to. And we weren't treating her like a child who was in need of protection. And so once she slips through the cracks of teachers who are seeing that she is not doing well at home, social workers who are getting complaint after complaint after complaint about a mother who is allegedly abusive and addicted to all kinds of drugs and not feeding her kids and allowing sexual predation in the home, right? No one has stepped in to take Malia under the care of the state. Now, we all know that the care of the state is not a solution almost ever to what we see in the lives of young people. But how do we have a system that is this negligent for kids? And then at the same time, when it comes to a point where they fall into the hands of police, we treat them as if they are adults. What kind of a society is this if that's how we are going to treat kids like Malia who are deeply in need of protection?
Mm-hmm. I mean, and you also mentioned that lower level dealers like Malia have no control over whether those pills are cut with fentanyl in the first place or whether it's a fatal dose. Did anyone that you interview or talk to talk about potential ways for law enforcement to get at higher level operators? It seems like the lower dealers like Malia are, the low-hanging fruit in some way for law enforcement, when it's harder to kind of unroot at the source. But did anyone that you talked to talk about potential ways to kind of get at the source?
I think the experts I was speaking to were speaking more to the problems with the reality of these charges rather than policing that could focus more on sourcing. I mean, one problem with that kind of policing is, I could see it in this case, is that these are police departments that are local, right? Like, they're not the De Pere Police Department, the Brown County Drug Task Force. They're doing very little work outside of their jurisdiction, and the fentanyl isn't coming from their jurisdiction. It's often coming from Mexico and then crossing state lines to get to Wisconsin, and then from Milwaukee getting into Green Bay or Brown County or into De Pere. So there's major difficulty as a local police officer in tracking down the source. I think what you can see in a case like Malia's and what's happening across the country is that the way that the criminal justice system has structured these charges is that you are charging someone with murder. And so that is the person who directly delivers a drug most of the time. And that's Malia in this case. And so, as you say, it's the low-hanging fruit. It's the little guys. It's not the source.
Right. And of course, I mean, local police departments, drug task force they're only going to be able to respond to the last in line in that epidemic.
That's certainly what I was seeing in De Pere, and quite frankly, what the investigators were telling me.
You also write that other prosecutors in Wisconsin, since Malia's case, have started, there have been more cases of juveniles that are charged with drug-induced homicide. I mean, do you anticipate that will be a trend now that continues, at least locally in Wisconsin or elsewhere? Do you think that we're going to see more states follow suit in that way?
I mean, I don't know, right? I think what was interesting to me was that once Malia's case was filed and she got a lot of local news coverage, there was no coverage really of any of the other kids who were charged after Malia. But once I started going through the records, I began to see it popping up and popping up and popping up in other parts of the state. And it made me wonder, how much prosecutors are learning from their colleagues in other counties, right? If you're a prosecutor in another part of Wisconsin and you see that the Brown County DA has brought these charges against a 15-year-old, you might be saying to yourself, oh, I can do that. I'll do that too. And so that's really what I wanted to get at with those numbers, is to allow readers to see what I was seeing, that this can become a trend very easily. You can watch it kind of snowball. And that's what I felt like I saw in Wisconsin over the year that I was reporting on this case.
Right. That up until Melea's case, this wasn't the norm. And then, after her case, that's perhaps setting a new precedent.
Exactly.
Well, I was going to ask you about the last quote of your story that's so gut-wrenching. It's, Jack's mother talking about kind of her stages of grief and the complexity of this situation. And she says, I lost my son, my only child, and here is Melea, who didn't have a mother. So it's like, I'm childless, she is motherless, and we're in this situation together, but against each other. When you heard that, did you think that this might be kind of a way to sum up this story with all of its complexity and the emotion? And how did you, was that your kind of plan to end it there? And what do you think that readers hopefully take away from this story at the end of this?
I thought it was possible I would end it there. I wasn't totally sure. I mean, I think when she said that, it really struck me. It was a way of kind of twisting the lens a little bit for me to see it differently. And I liked that I felt so surprised by her revelation there. I think when I came to this story, I was interested in many different victims of the opioid crisis among kids. And I think in that moment, what you are hearing Carrie articulate are these ghosts of the opioid crisis, right? Melea doesn't have a mother because her mother had her own addiction to opioids. Carrie doesn't have a son because her son found himself addicted to opioids. And here they are fighting each other in court when they are so deeply bonded by this similar and opposing trauma. And that's why I felt like it was such a powerful place to end. There's no winning here. Both of these people have been robbed of a family member and of an opportunity to be a family member. Melea with her mother and Carrie with her son. And I was hoping that that's what would come through in that quote.
Definitely. That it's, there's so many steps and pieces to this. And it's, maybe what you're left with is, those complexities of this situation and, everything that's happening before this leading to this point.
I think it's the complexities, and it's also quite simple, right? It's also just the grief of losing someone to this particular addiction, whether that's in a mother who can't be there for you or in a son who overdoses.
Absolutely. Well, Lizzie, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me, Amanda.
This episode of the Sunday Long Read podcast was produced by Matthew Whitehurst and me, Amanda Ulrich. The co-founders of the Sunday Long Read newsletter are Jacob Feldman and Don Van Natta Jr. If you like this episode, you can support us by following the Sunday Long Read on all your favorite platforms, and make sure to check out our newsletter if you haven't already. You can subscribe at sundaylongread.com/subscribe. Until next time, thanks for listening.